We're bracing for some pretty ugly unemployment figures on Thursday, and each case of that has a very sad, story behind it, with so many families around the country being affected. There's no doubt, though, of course, that it would have been a lot worse without the JobKeeper package.
Without JobKeeper, it certainly would have been a lot worse. Without JobSeeker, as you say, a lot of people would be in much worse circumstances than they will now find themselves. 10% coming up in the June quarter, that fits in with other private modelling that there's been done by the banks, for example, and the indications are that without JobKeeper, it would have been more like 20% by the June quarter. So clearly, the decision of the government to throw $130 billion at keeping people in employment in some form or other is going to be a very significant factor in reducing the impact of the coronavirus emergency. Whether it keeps us out of recession is another matter, but certainly a big plus, I think, in terms of the immediacy of the government's response as far as this is concerned, and also on the flexibility that Scott Morrison showed in initially rejecting out of hand anything like the JobKeeper proposal, and then very swiftly, when the implications of not acting became clearer and clearer to him, turning around and introducing it.
And we'll hear more on this shortly from the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. He will be holding a news conference in Canberra soon. Jim, the government seems to be suggesting that if restrictions are lifted, the focus will be on getting people back into their places of work. There's also been some debate, of course, about kids returning to school, with some leading epidemiologists now arguing that schools are actually very low risk. There in Victoria, where you are, I know school's resuming this week. The state, they're going to be a bit of a guinea pig in terms of how parents and teachers and students will handle term 2 as an online scenario.
It's going to be a very significant challenge, particularly for teachers, but also for parents, some of whom will be trying to work at home at the same time as they provide remote learning assistance for their children. I'm one of those people in that predicament, and hopefully I can do the right thing both by the people I'm doing work for and also, and in particular, for the 3 children I still have at school. But it's interesting, is it not, to look back and reflect a bit on what happened over Easter, a unique Easter as far as Australia is concerned, with the social distancing and isolation rules in place. I think there were significant fears on the part of the authorities that people would want to revert to the activities that normally occurred during this holiest of weeks. And in fact, it probably turned out better than they had feared. There appears to have been a bit of overzealousness, if I can put it that way, on the part of police in terms of the fines they dished out, and now some of those are being retracted. But I think that really reflected the concerns that people had. Now, as far as education is concerned, the whole country is now going to be going through a form of schooling that it has not had to deal with in the past. There are those in remote areas, of course, who've been going through this sort of process for years, decades indeed. But for the rest of us, it's going to be an interesting challenge indeed. And I will be interested to see whether we're up to it. I hope that we are. I hope that we can do right thing by our kids, and particularly by the teachers, who are going to find it very interesting how they manage 25 or 30 kids, all of them remotely, and not with the kinds of disciplines that are enforced at schools, and not with those moments to let off steam that kids require, the morning break and lunchtime and then the early afternoon. How that's all going to play out, I think, is going to be very interesting indeed. But if we do as well as we did over Easter, then perhaps my fears may be a little misplaced.
Well, I think you're right, although the testing, I guess, in the next few days and weeks will give us a clearer picture as to how Australians did behave over that Easter period. But you're right, authorities pretty pleased, it seems, with Australia's commitment to social distancing so far. The question is, I guess now, how well that is maintained once we keep seeing these infection rates dropping. Complacency is clearly the fear of the government and the health authorities at this point. When it comes to complacency on a global level, Jim, the reopening of the wet markets in China, it seems unfathomable from where we're sitting, but that's where that country is at now. They are supposed to abide by strict safety requirements to try and stop the virus spreading, but considering these live animal markets are right at the centre of this virus starting in the first place, it seems sensible to reassess their viability by this point.
You'd have to say, would you not, that unfathomable is a very fine word. It was the word that, a fine, very significant word. It was the word that the Prime Minister used this morning or in his most recent appearance to explain his reaction to what the World Health Organisation was saying, and also totally puzzled, he said, too. And I've got to say, I find it unfathomable, and equally I'm totally puzzled by the World Health Organisation's decision on this. The World Health Organisation's had a pretty spotty record, you'd have to say, through the course of the rise of the coronavirus. It was slow to act in declaring a pandemic. It apparently under pressure from the Chinese authorities initially. If the World Health Organisation is to restore the credibility that it would like to have post COVID-19, and when you see people like former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark suggesting there needs to be an international commission headed by the World Health Organisation, the World Bank and the IMF to manage the global response and the global activity in trying to prevent something like this happening again, where you have to wonder whether the World Health Organisation, as it's currently constituted and as its current behaviour has indicated, is the right body to do it. It clearly needs a shake-up, a revamp. It needs more authority and to be much less beholden to the influences of powerful members like China in particular, but I guess too the United States, whose own record with the World Health Organisation has not been terrific. It's withheld funds on occasion. So yes, unfathomable. I'm just amazed that the World Health Organisation could find any way at all in which it would endorse a reopening of these wet markets. I think it's an extraordinary piece of behaviour, that is for sure. Look, one other thing before I go, I'd like to add, just on this whole question of education and also on easing down the restrictions that we're currently seeing in place. The Prime Minister quite readily and quite clearly and quite wisely, I think, has suggested that we are tending to get ahead of it all here. One of the things that Greg Hunt, the Health Minister, has said that until and unless there is a plan to get out of this, then there's no way that he would countenance any reduction in the restrictions. And we also see from what's happened in northwest Tasmania, while general behaviour has been very good, just how readily, if instructions are failed to be observed, how quickly this thing can get away, just how virulent it is and how dangerous it can be, and what massive consequences there are, not just for the people of northwest Tasmania, but also for the doctors from other parts of Australia that will now have to serve them because others cannot be there. So it's one needs to be, I think, very, very wary about winding back restrictions until and unless, as Greg Hunt suggests, there is a clear pathway out of this, clear policy that can do it.